Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. And thanks for joining our Back to Basics webinar on the GCF's policy on prohibited practices. It's good to see you, many of you here again. As you remember, we organized similar webinar last year, December, and this is the continuation of our series, Back to Basics series on a GCF's integrity policy framework. So before we start, we will play the video to introduce policy on prohibited practices. And after the video playing, this is very short video, about 3 to 4 minutes, then we'll start our presentation on the webinar. Let's play the video.
The Green Climate Fund is the world's largest financing mechanism dedicated to helping developing countries respond to the climate emergency. The fund's activities align with the priorities of the countries, and it invests in low-emission, climate-resilient development, such as access to renewable energy, sustainable transportation, reliable water systems, and forest conservation initiatives. But mobilizing significant financial resources across continents is no easy task. This is why the GCF is firmly committed to a culture of integrity, one that ensures every GCF activity benefits the intended recipients. Meet Evan and his daughter Ava. Thanks to a solar panel grid project, their remote town will have access to clean and reliable energy. But Evan cannot benefit from the new power system because of the excessive costs involved in making the switch. Corrupt officials solicit bribes, which drive up prices and the cost of equipment. High prices leave Evan and his community with little choice but to keep using fossil fuels to drive their old diesel generators. The effects of corruption are devastating. People suffer from rising costs, poor quality of services and infrastructure, erosion of public trust in government and institutions, and generally, have a diminished quality of life. Strong safeguards must therefore be in place to eliminate prohibited practices that threaten the transparent and efficient use of GCF resources. GCF has a zero-tolerance policy for prohibited practices, ensuring that all parties involved in its activities adhere to the highest integrity standards. The Independent Integrity Unit of the GCF proactively works to prevent and deter occurrences of prohibited practices and investigate any allegations of such wrongdoing. Here are the prohibited practices and their examples. Corruption occurs when a bidder bribes an official to win a contract or to facilitate an activity. Fraud occurs when a party falsifies documents. Collusion happens when parties agree to submit inflated bills, fix the prices of goods, or limit the availability of materials and supplies. Coercion occurs when one party threatens another into committing an illegal act, violate GCF policies, or take any undue action for their benefit. Obstruction occurs when a party takes any action to impede an investigation or the fund's access to information. Abuse, when someone diverts GCF funds and assets to personal benefit. Retaliation against whistleblowers or witnesses, when an employee is denied benefits or promotions for reporting wrongdoing. Sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment, when staff pays for or solicits sexual services. In the GCF, there are severe consequences for violating the policy against prohibited practices. These include debarment, paying restitution, reprimand, and other remedies as defined in the relevant policies. Compliance with integrity policies ensures that communities achieve maximum benefits. With these safeguards and with community participation, Evan and his family can now have access to solar energy at an affordable price and free from an intimidating environment. Building a culture of integrity at GCF works to ensure that all activities meet their respective goals and positively impact the lives of the intended people and communities. It's our duty to speak against corruption and other undue practices, help champion high-integrity standards in GCF-funded activities, report prohibited practices to the Independent Integrity Unit.
5,
I hope you enjoyed that video. So to those who just joined us, this is the Back to Basics webinar on GCF policy and prohibited practices. My name is Bayert Sturjigmedash, and I'm Outreach and Engagement Manager for the Independent Integrity Unit of the GCF. So let's start our webinar. So this is the webinar, educational webinar, to provide an general overview of the prohibited practice, policy on prohibited practices, and also provide overview of the some of the obligations and some procedures related to the prohibited practice policy. Let's start. So our webinar consists of, so today's agenda, we have the introduction of the Independent Integrity Unit. And yes, so as you see here in the agenda, in the webinar, we will provide the introduction of the IAU. Perhaps many of you will knows about IAU's activities and mandates, but we'll give you a little bit the refresher of the IAU's activities, and also a general overview of the GCF integrity framework. Then we will go to the topic of today's webinar, the policy on prohibited practices, and policy's objectives and obligations. Then we will move to definitions of the specific types of prohibited practices. And then lastly, we will cover the consequences for the violations and how to report those integrity violations. And last, we will have an opportunity for a question and answer session. And today's webinar, it will be approximately 60 minutes, maybe a little more than that. And this is a very interactive webinar, which means we will have many quizzes and many participatory tools. So I hope that you will have active participation in our quizzes and Q&A session. So let's start. So the first quick overview of the Independent Integrity Unit, as I said, perhaps at this stage, our accredited entities, you well aware of Independent Integrity Unit. We are one of the accountability mechanism established by the board, GCF's board, and it's stipulated by GCF's governing instruments. We are independent units, and we are the independent oversight function of the GCF. We report directly to the board through the Ethics and Audit Committee of the board. However, even we are independent units, we work closely with GCF Secretariat, and we also report administratively to the Executive Director. The next slide. So here you will see how IAU operates within the mandates that is stipulated in our terms of reference. So perhaps many of you know that IAU's main mandate is investigation, which is, as you see on the far right on the corner, integrity and anti-corruption. So we do investigate the allegations and wrongdoings of the prohibited practices and also misconduct. And also we do have the prevention mandate that is also stipulated in our terms of reference. So we provide the capacity building training, and we also provide the outreach and engagement and cooperation, strategic partnership with partner organizations. So today's webinar is part of our capacity building mandate. And far left, you see that one of our preventive mandate is provides the integrity risk advisory and also provide the compliance advisory to our counterparties and to our GCF's secretariat. So next slide. And here I would like to emphasize IAU's capacity building mandate. So one of the main priority, the new and main priority for IAU is to strengthen our capacity building for our accredited entities. So the main activity within the capacity building is the series of trainings. So we do organize a series of trainings and webinars for AEs and for our internal staff. And then we also develop and share the knowledge products. And the part of the capacity building, we also right now working on the integrated learning model. This is the e-learning model on integrated topics, and it's self-paced tool that soon it will be utilized and would be accessible to you to all AEs. And then we have the peer-to-peer learning alliances that will be expanded and engaged soon with many other AEs for peer learning and best practices opportunities. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So now let's move to the GCF Integrity Policy Framework overview. So as many of you know, AEs are required to comply with the Integrity Policy Framework. And here you'll see the set of policies, starting from the policy on prohibited practices, which is today's webinar going to delve into greater details. And then we have this other set of policies with the mandate of prevention. It starts with the code of conduct, but it applies to the GCF staff. And then the policies on the ethics and the conflict of interest. And then we have separate policy that has been adopted by the board, anti-money laundering and counter-finance and terrorism. And then we have fiduciary standards. As many of you know, when you first initiated and started the accreditation process, you've gone through the GCF fiduciary standards compliance procedure. And then lastly, within the prevention, we do have the policy, separate policy on the sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So the second set of policy is with regard to detection mandates. That is the specific policy on the protection of whistleblowers and witnesses. That policy also requires AEs to comply and provides specific provisions to protect whistleblowers and witnesses. And then we have the special policy and investigation standards when the alleged and suspected prohibited practice occurs. We have the investigation standards that should comply within our investigation procedures. And then lastly, the remediation. When we finalize our investigation, there will be the remedies and there will be the disbarring and exclusion procedures would apply to those occasions. Okay, so these are the framework for the GCF integrity. Now let's move on to today's topic, the background policy, policy on prohibited practices. So this is the policy approved by the board. It's the number is B22/19. It was approved 4 years ago by the GCF board. So here you see the specific the objective of the policy. So the policy establishes the specific conduct and activities which are prohibited within the funded activities of the GCF. And then it also outlines the obligations of GCF accredited entities to uphold the integrity. And policy also describes the actions by GCF when prohibited practices are alleged to have occurred. And then in this policy, we states that GCF has zero tolerance to the prohibited practices, which means that any scope or any types of prohibited practice will not be tolerated. The next slide. So before we proceed with presentation of the policy, let's test your knowledge on prohibited practices. As I reminded you, this webinar is very interactive. We will have many quizzes. So that will be our first quiz. And the first test is what are accredited entities' obligation regarding the prohibited practices. So here you have 5 options. So the first, report only major integrity violations to the IAU. B, required to disclose allegations of prohibited practices within GCF-funded projects. C, observe highest integrity standards for 10 months of the year. D, all of the above. E, none of the above. So let's start votes. So now I hope in your screen you have options to provide your answers in accordance with the options, either A, B, C, D, E. So I'll give you 1 minute. So let's start answering the polls. Okay. So I hope you also can see the options. You can read the options as well. Good. So the result of the polling. Okay. So thank you for choosing the right answer. As many of you choose the right answer, the right choice is B. Indeed, the policy on prohibited practices requires AEs. In our case, all of you are required to disclose allegations of prohibited practices within the GCF-funded projects. So thank you. You are very well knowledgeable on the general obligations. So the policy provides the general obligation of accredited entities. So of course, there are general principles that mandates our AEs in their funded activities. So of course, observe high standards of integrity and accountability and efficiency. And then refrain from directly or indirectly condoning, encouraging or participating or engaging prohibited practices in any fund-related activities. And lastly, avoid situations or activities that might reflect adversely on the GCF or compromise its operations or lead to real, also perceived conflict of interest. So those are the general principles that applies to our AEs. And then we have specific obligations. So move to the next slide. So we have the specific obligations that mandates our AEs. So it can be categorized in 3 types with regard related to reporting, investigation, and response. So policy requires that all AEs should timely report any alleged or suspected or confirmed integrity violations to IAU. It also mandates promptly disclose to the GCF any real or perceived conflict of interest in relation to fund-related activity. So here also please emphasize, it's not only, we're talking about conflict of interest, not only the actual conflict of interest, but also the potential or perceived conflict of interest. This is also very important to note. And secondly, in terms of the investigation, so the policy mandates and obligates our AEs to investigate any occurrence of or report of suspected prohibited practices in any fund-related activity. And it also mandates report preliminary and final findings of investigation to the GCF. I'm sure that all of our AEs have internal either investigation units or integrity units or some sort of unit that is mandated to investigate internal wrongdoings or prohibited practices. So in the case, if you have the investigation unit or similar counterparty should share and report to the preliminary and final findings to the GCF, to the IAU. And then also, similarly, the AEs should cooperate fully with GCF if IAU starts the investigation in connection with the prohibited practices. And then that's lastly, with regard to response mandate, the obligation, the AEs mandated to respond to and mitigate and remedy to, any prohibited practices that is found to have occurred in a fund-related activity and take actions to prevent in the future. And also, we should make ensure that individuals or entities that is sanctioned by the GCF do not participate any fund-related activities in the violation of the administrative sanction. So those are the remedies in the response related obligations of the AEs. So let's move on. Next obligation is the scope of obligation. So whom this policy applies. So when policy stipulates the counterparties, the list of counterparties. So in the case of AEs, it includes all the GCF accredited entities. That would include both international access entities and also direct access entities. And also, the policy applies to executing entities, as well as delivery partners, and then the fiscal agents, financial intermediaries, and also the vendors within the funded activity, and also those entities that directly disperse GCF resources. And that also includes the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program. So those are the scope of the policy that applies to. Okay, and then let's move to next. So now let's cover the specific types of the prohibited practices. So the policy sets out each and every types of prohibited practices. So we'll go through each types of the prohibited practices. So before let's start. So let's continue with our test, the quizzes. Let's test your knowledge on the specific types of the prohibited practices. So we will give you some example cases, and there you have a choice. You need to choose the choices accordingly. So the case scenario is, so a contractor offers money to an employee of an implementing entity to obtain a procurement award in GCF-funded project. What type of prohibited practice is this? So you have four choices. A, fraud. B, obstruction. C, corruption. D, money laundering. So let's give him 1 minute. So please go ahead and pick the choice. So the result is we have majority voted for option C, which is corruption. So, and then we have a few options, option A and D, fraud and money laundering. So let's see the correct answer. Yes, as we all expected, you should all know, in this case scenario, it is the type of the prohibited practice is the corruption. Okay, so what is the corruption? So the policy on prohibited practices provides the definition of the corruption. So it defines, this is the act of promising or offering, giving, receiving, or soliciting anything of value or any act that involves the abuse of authority for the purpose of influencing the actions of another party or for the purpose of obtaining undue advantage. So that is the exact test of the policy that applies to you, to AEs, and to all intermediaries. Okay, so now let's move to next type of the prohibited practice. And then with our usual tradition, let's continue our quizzes. So this is another case scenario. So you need to choose, guess the type of the prohibited practices. So the case scenario is the project manager of GCF-funded project deliberately misleads other GCF staff into choosing a company for the contract that is project manager has the shares in. What type of prohibited practice is this? So we have four choices: A, fraud; B, coercion; C, money laundering; D, financing of terrorism. So let's have 1 minute to provide your answers. Thanks again for your active participation. So we have almost equal numbers of answers. So the option A, 57% of our participants voted for option A, which is fraud. And then 43%, almost the half of the participants voted for option B, coercion. So it's quite tricky, huh? So let's see the results, the correct answer. Yes, so it's indeed the fraud. This is the scenario of the type of prohibited practices that falls under the fraud. So let's see the definition of the fraud under the policy. So policy defines fraud means any act or omission that knowingly misleads or attempts to mislead or party for the purpose of obtaining financial or other undue advantage or to avoid an obligation. So it includes the omission or inaction as well. Good. So now let's move on the next type of the prohibited practice. And again, we will test your knowledge on that. So you can see the case scenario on the next prohibited practices. So the case is a local construction company threatens to damage the structure for the GCF-funded project if they are not awarded the contract to complete the work. What type of prohibited practice is this? So we have four options: A, corruption; B, coercion; C, obstruction; D, abuse. So again, we'll give you 1 minute to run through the options and provide your answers in the poll. Okay. I can see people start to provide in their options and answers. Okay, so now let's see the results. Okay, so the 70% of our participants voted for option B, coercion. And then we have few answers for option C and D. So let's see what's the correct answer. Yes, indeed, as many of you answered, it's option B, it's coercion. So let's see the definition of the coercion under the policy. So the policy on prohibited practices defines coercion as the act of impairing or harming or threatening to do so directly or indirectly any party or the property of the party for the purpose of improperly influencing the actions of the party. So again, I would like to emphasize it includes both direct and also indirect acts as well. Okay, so let's move to the next type of prohibited practice. So the policy includes several types of prohibited practices. So we need to go through all the types of prohibited practices in this webinar. So again, we have quizzes on the next type of prohibited practices. So in this time, the case scenario is 2 solar companies bidding for a contract on GCF-funded project agrees to limit the number of panels. Agree to number of panels in the market to keep the prices high and to split the award. What type of prohibited practice is this? So we have 4 choices again. A, retaliation against the whistleblowers or witness. B, money laundering. C, financing of terrorism. D, collusion. So again, we'll give you 1 minute. So please read carefully and provide your answers. Okay, I can see people started falling in. Okay, so let's see the result. Okay, correct answer is, so the poll results. So yes, 90% of the majority of the participants voted for option choice D, which is collusion, which is correct answer. I'm very proud of you, our partners and participants. You're very well done on the prohibited practices. Indeed, the collusion stipulated in the policy, it is act of an arrangement between 2 or more parties designed to achieve an improper purpose, including for the purpose of improperly influencing the actions of another party. So that would be the collusion that we should be avoid from. Okay, so the next, and I think the last type of prohibited practice. So we have 2 more, yes. Okay, so let's again, quick quiz on our knowledge. So the case scenario is an employee at an accredited entity deliberately conceals the documents relevant to IAU investigation concerning the GCF-funded project. What type of prohibited practice is this? A, abuse. B, obstruction. C, corruption. D, fraud. Okay, give you 1 minute. Please read again if needed the case scenario and provide your answers. Okay, I can see the also coming in. Okay, so let's see the results. Great. So the majority of the participants voted for obstruction, which is our correct answer. It's indeed the case of the obstruction. And policy provides the definition for the obstruction quite extensively. So it includes the deliberately destroying or falsifying, altering, or concealing evidence or information relevant to fund investigation, or making false statements to investigators to materially impede or fund investigation, or threatening, harassing, or intimidating any party to prevent the disclosure of knowledge related to investigation. Or lastly, the materially impeding the fund's contractual rights of audit or access to information. Great. So the next prohibited practices, again, quick quiz. I think now we will very well experienced and well versed with the prohibited practices in our quizzes. So we will be very quick in upcoming quizzes and types of prohibited practices. So here is the case. So contractor working on the GCF-funded project drives an official GCF vehicle, car, to take his family on vacation. What type of prohibited practice is this? A, abuse. B, financing of terrorism. C, collusion. D, coercion. Okay, we'll give you 1 minute. Please start polling in. Okay, let's see the results. Great. So now I can see the real progress. So we all picking the correct answers, majority of our participants. So the 91% of our audience chose the correct answer, which is abuse. So the policy defines abuse as a theft, misappropriation, waste, or improper use of property or assets related to fund-related activity, either committed intentionally or through reckless disregard. So that is the definition of the policy. Okay, so let's move on. We have a few more. So the next, the case scenarios. The company hired on a GCF project creates fake invoices and receipts to disguise funds originating from criminal activity as a legitimate income from the GCF. What type of prohibited practice is this? A, money laundering. B, obstruction. C, abuse. D, collusion. Okay, again, we'll give you 1 minute. Maybe even less so, as we now hopefully very well experienced with the polling. Okay. So let's see results, if it's ready. Oh, great. So majority of participants voted for the money laundering, which was the correct answer. Very happy to see the progress of our participants, the knowledge and prohibited practices. So yeah, the money laundering it's in line with the international standards and international the definition. The policy provides the types of acts under the money laundering. So it includes the transfer of property, knowing that it's derived from crime for the purpose of concealing the illicit origin of the property or assisting any person involved to evade the legal consequences. And also the concealment or disguise of the true nature, source, location, disposition, movement, or rights of the property derived from crime. And lastly, the acquisition and possession or use of property, knowing that at the time of receipt, such property was derived from criminal offense. So that is prohibited in our funded activity. Okay, so next quiz. So we have just a few more, and then we will be done. So the next case scenario is the staff member within the accredited entity is denied promotion because of her cooperation with IAU's investigation. What type of prohibited practice is this? A, corruption. B, retaliation against whistleblowers or witness. C, collusion. D, abuse. I hope it's very easy and we can answer quickly. So let's see the polling results. Great, so 100%. It's clear case of the retaliation against the whistleblower or witness. Okay, so the policy also clearly defines the act of retaliation. So any detrimental act recommended or threatened or taken against the whistleblower or witness or person associated with them because of his or her report of suspected wrongdoing or cooperation with the fund, investigation by the whistleblower or witness. So that is the definition in the policy. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on the last quiz. Good. So the last quiz, the case scenario is the AE, accredited entity, uses GCF funds to pay a company involved in terrorist activities to work on GCF project. What type of prohibited practice is this? A, obstruction, B, abuse, C, money laundering, D, financing of terrorism. Okay, so that's falling in, and I hope it's quite straightforward and easy scenario, and we will be quick with the polling. So let's see the results. Yes, of course, it's a financing of terrorism. It's a clear and straightforward case of the financing terrorism. And policy also clearly stipulates the definition of the financing terrorism. It involves the solicitation, collection, or provision of funds with the intention that they may be used to support terrorist acts or organization. So funds may stem from both legal and illicit sources. So this is also the broad definition for the financing terrorism in the policy that is in line with international best practice and definition. Okay, so now we went through all the types and definitions of the prohibited practices in the policy. Let's move on. The next section of our webinar, which is about the consequences of violation. So what happens if those the types of policy, the prohibited practices occurs? So after the investigation, and we find that indeed the prohibited practices has occurred, then as you see here, these are the consequences for the violation. So the first, the GCF IAU, we just recently introduced new debarment system. It will be fully operationalized soon. We have the exclusion policy that has been adopted by the board last year. So with that policy, the violators of the prohibited practices will be debarred and sanctioned. Or it will be, another choice is there will be conditional debarment, or there will be another option, debarment with conditional release, and then restitution or suspension for a certain time period, or the cancellation of the contract, disbursement, or the project contribution. And then lastly, the downgrading of the accreditation. So it does have many levels of consequences, and not only the project level, but also in the accreditation level. So let's move on to events of default. So if you recall in our MEA with you, so we have the clause number 19. In your accreditation master agreements, we have this clause states that AE shall be if it is in default agreement in respect of the funded activity, in the case of engaged in prohibited practices, without taking timely or appropriate action to address it, then fund may terminate the agreement and suspend the further payment and seek refund or restitution and claim damages. So I'm just reminding you the AMA clause that we have GCF with you, with all our entities, accredited entities in the case of default, in the case of the breach of prohibited practices. So I hope we covered all the definitions of prohibited practices and your obligations and specific obligations under the prohibited practices and the consequences and in the event of the breaches of that policy. And here is our reporting channels. So if you recall, as I mentioned in the presentation, you're obligated to report and you're obligated to share any suspected wrongdoing or the preliminary findings or the final findings of investigation to IAU. So here you can see all the contact numbers. We have 24/7 hotline and 3 languages. And we have a phone number, the international and also local South Korean phone number that is accessible to all AEs and other counterparties. And then we have email, we are accessible email and reporting online on our website. So, and on social media, we're also accessible and reachable to the sharing, reporting, and as well as sharing all our IAU's activities, integrity-related activities. So we hope to hear more from you, not only the reporting on the prohibited practices, but also some of the IAU-related activities. Okay, so now we are reaching the end of the webinar. So this is the chance for you to ask the questions. Questions with regard to this webinar, the presentation and slides, and also in general, the policy on the prohibited practices. You can leave your questions. You can leave your questions in the chat. And yes, I can see the questions coming in the chat. And also, we also offer, IAU offers the advisory service to AEs, to all our AEs, and also the delivery partners on integrity-related questions, specific questions, not specifically maybe related to investigation, but all general integrity policy related or integrity policy framework related questions. We will be very happy to provide clarifications or answers or general advisory assistance, the questions or requests that you may have with regard to implementation of these policies. So I can see the question, the chat. What does restitution entail? So the policy on prohibited practices on sorry. So the policy stipulates that yeah, thanks for the question. So the restitution entails the refund of GCF proceeds or other GCF funds extend to such funds have to improperly used. So that's the scope of the restitution. So all of it should be refunded of GCF proceeds or any other GCF funds that is improperly used as a type of the prohibited practices. So I hope it covered your question. And again, I know this webinar was a lot to digest for you with regard to the policy and the specific types of prohibited practices. So as I said, we would very much welcome to contact us after the webinar through this email address, iauadvisory@gcf.org, to ask any specific questions with regard to this policy or any other policy. So, okay, so I can see another question in the chat. Is there a list of GCF sanctioned vendors or entities available? Thanks for this question. So as I mentioned, our exclusions policy is new. It's been adopted just recently by the board, and it's being operationalized quite soon. So soon with this operationalization at the GCF, we will have the list of sanctioned vendors and entities soon, hopefully within this year. Okay, so thanks again for your active participation, and we hope to hear from you after the webinar and coming days. And as I mentioned, this is series of training and webinar sessions. So please stay tuned. Our Back to Basics webinar will be continued on the specific topics and specific policies. And also, please stay tuned to our IAU's upcoming events. Tonight, we will have another webinar exclusively deals on the whistleblower protection. Tonight, in 10 p.m. the Korean time zone. So more information, you can get this link and you can register in the Zoom. And also tomorrow, we're going to have our next series of integrity talk. In this integrity talk, we have guest speaker from the World Bank, INT, our counterparty office at the World Bank, which the Mr. Alan Bakaris will share the World Bank experience in dealing with the integrity risks in their in their projects. It will be tomorrow, 9 p.m. in a Korean time zone. And then there is a very important forum event is coming up. I would like to encourage you to sign up, especially for direct access entities. So our second integrity forum is going to be organized in Bangkok, Thailand, in September 13 to 15. So this is the capacity building and learning forum for our direct access entities, organized by Integrity Forum. The first forum was organized in Madrid in 2019. So after the COVID, we reorganizing our second forum. So please sign up, and we will provide many learning opportunities and learning sessions during the forum. So as I said, please go and visit our website and register to the Zoom link and the events registration list. Thank you very much for your active participation, and look forward to your engagements in future events and future Back to Basics webinar. Thanks for your attention, and have a good rest of the day.